This is a video about the use of the process macro that was developed by Andrew Hayes and its use for moderation and mediation analysis and path analysis. We are going to be applying it to SPSS. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go to this website right here, and this is a free download. So go to processmacro.org/download.html. Get to this page, come down here. There are two different options. I don't have the appropriate documentation for how to run process 3, so I'm going to focus on process 2.6. So I'm going to click on that. It's going to provide us the download. I'm going to save it to my desktop. Okay. So one of the challenges we have with running this macro is that you probably have to install it as an administrator for SPSS. So to do that, you're going to go to wherever you have SPSS tagged, whether it's 23 or 24 or 25. Right click on it, go to where it says More, and then say Run as Administrator. We're then going to open up SPSS, and we are going to go to the data set that I'm going to be using to demonstrate this. The data is in SPSS. It is path Ingram.3. This is a data set that was provided through Carl Wunsch at East Carolina University. I'm going to open that up. And once I get that open, I'm going to install the macro. So to install the macro, we go to Extensions, and this is on 25, so 25 is different from prior versions. Some versions allow you to go directly to Utilities to do it, but with 25 we have to go to Extensions, then down to Utilities, and then over to Install Custom Dialog. So what you're always trying to get to, depending on the version of your SPSS, is you're trying to get to Install Custom Dialog. Sometimes you will get to it directly through Utilities. Sometimes you have to go to Extensions and then Utilities and then Install Custom Dialog. So we're going to find our file, and it's right there. So you can click on that and then click Open. Now, I already have this installed, but this is the first notice that you should get. And then to make sure that it was installed, you go to Analyze, Regression, and you're looking for process 2.16. Okay, so this is what we're looking for. Okay, one of these two, they're both the same program. Okay, so that tells us that we have run it successfully. So the data set that I'm going to demonstrate this on is from a test of the theory of planned behavior by Ozgen, and this is for individuals who are applying to graduate school or making a decision about applying to graduate school. So within Ozgen's model, we have attitudes towards the behavior, the subjective norms of the community about the behavior, the individual's perceived behavioral control about whether or not they can actually implement the behavior. These three factors, attitude, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, relate to or are predictive of or causally related to the intention of somebody to actually engage in a behavior. Intention to engage in a behavior predicts whether or not the behavior will actually be implemented. So within this model, we would have, if we were to draw it, we would have lines going from attitude to intent, subjective norms to intent, perceived behavioral controls to intent, and from intent directly to behavior. One of the things that we are going to test here, we're going to modify the model a little bit, and we're going to see whether or not there is an interaction between attitudes and subjective norms as it relates to intent. Okay, so we'll not only look at the direct effect, but we'll also look to see whether there's an interaction. We will also see whether or not perceived behavioral control has a direct effect on behavior, and whether or not the effect of perceived behavioral control on behavior is actually mediated through intent. Okay, so the moderation analysis, which is an interaction analysis, is going to be between attitudes and subjective norms going to intent, and the mediation analysis is going to be from perceived behavioral control to behavior through the mediator of intent. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to document or demonstrate how you can actually run the interaction analysis. So again, to do that, we're going to go to Analyze. We're going to go down to Regression. We're going to go to down here to Process. We have all of our variables here. So for this first one, in which we are looking for an interaction, our dependent variable is going to be intention. So we send intention to outcome, and our independent variable in this case is going to be attitude, and the M variables are either going to be the moderator variables or the mediator variables. So in this case, the moderator variable is the one that we think that interacts with attitude, and that in this case was subjective norm. So we're going to send that there. So within the process model, the main things that we're messing with are this is model number. So the model number 1 tells us that we're testing for moderation. We're testing for an interaction. Okay, so when we click on that model number 1, we're then going to go over here to options, and we're going to click on the first 4 that are listed here. Okay, these are the primary ones that relate to understanding moderation or interaction. So we're going to click continue. We're going to go to conditioning and click on this Johnson-Nyman effect. We're going to click on continue, and then we are going to click OK, and this is going to run the model for us. It takes a little bit of time because it is bootstrapping the entire data set about 1,000 times. So it takes a little bit longer than we might like for it to run. We get spoiled with SPSS because it's so fast. But when you run bootstrapping techniques, you know that it's going to take a little bit longer. So for this first one, our dependent variable is intent. We have attitude as our predictor, subjective norm as our interaction effect. We come down here, and just like in any SPSS or SAS output, we see our predictors here, and we see that it has already created this interaction term. So what this interaction term is telling us, this is the interaction term that we would have had to have created by hand. It's a centered interaction term. So what we would have done in SPSS is we would have found the mean for subjective norm for the whole sample, and we would have found the mean for attitude for the entire sample, and we would have then found the deviation score for every single individual. So it would be their score minus the mean. That would have generated the deviation, and then we would have created a product of the deviation scores for subjective norms and attitudes, and that would have given us the interaction. One of the benefits of the Hayes program process is that it does it for us. Okay, so it automatically creates that interaction term. So within this data, what we see here is we see the overall R squared, the composite R, composite correlation amongst all of these variables and intent. We are explaining about 59%. That's the R squared. We're explaining about 59%. It's telling us, this p-value over here is telling us that we are explaining more than zero variance. Okay, so this is testing whether or not this correlation is zero, whether this R square is zero. We see that this F value is huge, so we know that we're going to reject that null hypothesis. So, so that tells us that we do have an effect. We are accounting for a significant amount of variance, greater than zero variance, and it happens to be 59%. We then go down here, and these are unstandardized slopes. So attitude here, 0.4, is telling us that for every 1 unit increase in attitude, we are accounting for about 4/10 or 0.41% of a 0.4 intent. Okay, so for every 1 unit increase in attitude, intent goes up by about 0.4. Of these predictors of subjective norm and attitude and interaction, the only significant predictor is attitude. Okay, so again, these are all in unstandardized slopes. If you want to get the beta, at this point you're going to have to go, at least with this edition of PROCESS, you're going to have to go and rerun it in SPSS to see what happens with the betas if you need them. So we come down here, and we know that we don't find that the interaction is significant. That p-value of 0.9654 here is the same one here. So it's telling us that we essentially have parallelism, that the effect is not, that we don't have a significant interaction effect. So what PROCESS does is it helps us figure out if we do have a significant interaction, where it might be. So it blocks out subjective norms in terms of 3 different levels, and then it looks at the slope that would be associated with attitude for each one of those different levels. And what we see is that each one of these slopes is about 0.41. Okay, so just like with any ANOVA, the interaction effect here is really a test of whether or not we have parallelism of these slopes. And what we're finding here is that every single one of these slopes is essentially the same, right? It's all about 0.41. So that's why we end up with such a large p-value here, is because there's no way that there's any evidence of interaction here. If there was, in all likelihood, we would find a significant range with these slopes, right? There'd be a 0.7 and a 0.2, or a -4 and a +2, or something like that. But we don't find anything like that. So that just confirms to us that there is no interaction effect. Okay, so this is just more information that kind of adds to it. We're not going to spend time covering that. So the next thing that I want us to do is I want us to look at kind of understanding whether or not we have a mediation effect. So we're interested in seeing whether or not perceived behavioral control has a direct effect on behavior, and whether or not intent has a direct effect on behavior, and whether perceived behavioral control has a direct effect on intent. So if there is an effect, and if there is an indirect effect of perceived behavioral control onto behavior through intent, that indicates that there is a mediated relationship there. With SPSS, we have ways of testing, of determining all of these slopes amongst all of these variables, but we don't really have a good method within SPSS of testing whether or not that mediation effect is statistically significant. The PROCESS program helps us do that by bootstrapping and testing whether or not the confidence intervals for those bootstraps overlap 0. So again, to do that, we're going to go to Analyze, back down to Regression, back down to our PROCESS program. We're going to change things around now. Okay, so in this time, our dependent variable is going to be behavior. We're going to see if perceived behavioral control has an effect, and we're also going to send intention down here to the M variable. Okay, so now we're going to go back to options, and instead of clicking instead of clicking the top 4, we're going to click the bottom 4. Okay, and the Sobel test we may or may not be interested in, but for our purposes, we're just going to run all of these. We're going to click continue. We're going to want to make sure that we do have these confidence intervals required, because this is what we're going to use to test whether or not the mediation is significant. We then are going to click on OK, and just that fast we have our test. So it's thinking about it, and finally it gives us our results. So again, what we see is the dependent variables behavior, perceived behavioral control over the applying for graduate school behavior is the primary predictor, and we are interested in whether or not perceived behavioral control has a mediated effect on behavior through intention to apply to graduate school. So the first set of predictors we have is everything that goes to behavior. Sorry, folks, I'm trying to figure out. What happened here? I'm going to go back to my model because I don't understand what I have here. Oh, I know what I did. I didn't change the sorry, this has to change to 4. Okay, so make sure you've changed your model to 4. Okay, so it's behavior, perceived behavioral control, intention, but change the model from a 1 to a 4. 4 is the one that we use for mediation. I didn't change that, so it was treating intention like an interaction term with perceived behavioral control rather than a mediator. So everything else should be fine now. Sorry for the confusion. Again, mediation model is 4, moderation model is 1. There we go. That's better. Okay, so the dependent the first outcome that it's going to look at for us is intent. So it's seeing whether or not there is a significant relationship between perceived behavioral control and intent. We look at that p-value, so we see that that relationship is significant. So this is the first path within the mediation model, because intent is the mediator in our model. So does perceived behavioral control have a relationship to intent? For a model to be mediated, you must have a significant relationship between the predictor and the mediator, and a significant relationship between the mediator and the outcome. So what we see here is we do have a significant effect between the predictor and the mediating variable. This is an unstandardized slope, so it's telling us for every 1 unit increase in perceived behavioral control, intention increases by about 1/4 of a point. The R squared is about 21%, so 21% of the variability in intention is explained by perceived behavioral control, and again, as we had indicated earlier, that effect is statistically significant at the 0.01 level. The next one, our dependent variable is behavior. We have 2 different predictors now, because we indicated we had our mediator going to behavior and we had perceived behavioral control going directly to behavior. Both of those variables are statistically significant. We see that for every 1 unit increase in intention, behavior increases by about 1.5 points. For every 1 unit increase in intention, perceived behavioral control increases by about 3/4 of a point. the overall R squared that is explained in behavior by intent and perceived behavioral control is about 34%. Okay, so we now have all of our main effects accounted for. We have not looked at perceived behavioral control to behavior yet. So we did 0.734. So this is the direct effect not being affected by intent. That effect is strong, but again, what we're really interested in is when we come down here and we looked at the indirect effect. So this is the indirect effect. So this is the effect that we would get from multiplying the effect between perceived behavioral control and intent, and then from intent to behavior. So if we multiplied those two unstandardized slopes, we would get 0.35. So what our real question is whether or not that effect of 0.35 is greater than would have occurred due to random sampling fluctuation alone. And the way that PROCESS figures that out is that it essentially computes about 1,000 of these effects to get the estimated range. So this is the lower limit of that confidence interval, and this is the upper limit of that confidence range. And what we're looking to see is whether or not this confidence range incorporates 0. If it does not, then we can assume that that relationship is statistically significant. So we have evidence of a mediated relationship. So since this band does not include 0, we can argue that we do have a mediated effect, that the effect of perceived behavioral control to behavior is mediated through intention. I hope that makes some sense to you, and that is the end of the presentation. Hope it helps.